There is a lot of process behind a news story. To produce a news story involves reporting and writing. That means engagement, solitary synthesis, and communication. Yes, there have been changes over time, but reporters still write, take notes, interview people, and use the technology available. Differences in production and process aren't just black and white and color, or written and spoken and visual. Reporters are still doing what they always did. They produce stories. They produce discourse in conjunction with others. Reporting, asking questions, producing and presenting a story, again and again, day in, day out. Behind the news, there is a lot of routine and repetition, a lot of given assumptions and practices behind the stories we get. I'm interested in this repetition of process, of story, of text. I'm interested in iterativity in news stories. So I'll talk a bit about iterativity in news discourse and a bit about how new iterations of technology might be driving the news outcomes online. What is iterativity? How can we define repetition in the context of media linguistics and of news discourse? We can formalize it. Some linguists try to characterize operations involving language by implementing abstract theory and formal schema to account for predictable patterns. I'm not going to do that here. Another approach is to look at iterativity from the applied linguistic perspective. Every news story starts with a basic outline and shape, a pre-formulation. It gets built up, the words and images providing structure and shades of meaning with each iteration of process, with each addition or edit. That's helpful, but the best account of iterativity in news discourse would allow us to say something about structure and use or application. So iterativity here is the repetition and circulation of journalistic form and concurrent cultural meaning in news stories. I'll give some examples of how this is manifested. In news stories, iterativity can be cyclical. Stories arise again and again. The topics, as well as the news angle, return year after year. In this case, two feature stories 15 years apart share similar themes and memes, emphasizing the bond forged and its own reiteration that takes place on this day each year. Stories are also tied to seasonal, calendar-based events and occasions, which the community at large tends to share. We start the new year with resolutions and conclude the old year with a retrospective or top 10 summary of news and culture stories. And in between, there's a predictable assortment of season-linked reporting. This list gives a partial account. Stories are also tied to important historical events and commemorations. Anniversary stories are key to this subgenre. In this example, newspapers from Colorado and California acknowledge the date and refer to and repeat Neil Armstrong's iconic "Giant Leap for Mankind" catchphrase for different effect and a different readership 40 years on. Which brings us to a focus on repetition internal to the story. Story internal iterativity includes many elements. Sources, for instance. The same experts are often quoted. Updates between editions. We can see what changes. The use of boilerplate, or the shorthand summaries in ongoing news stories that remind us of what's happened thus far. And, thanks to the internet, this repetition is also recursive, in that stories can repeat themselves indefinitely across multiple platforms and story forms. Now I'm going to illustrate traceable recursivity and show how I started with one story online and clicked to the next one and two more after that to solve a mystery and raise some questions, which began with a double-decker bus. This headline on a Yahoo Sports blog caught my attention. London man DQs is disqualified after taking bus for final 5 miles of marathon. It didn't add up. I see a London bus, but the photo shows it's in the country. London man? Where was this marathon? Was a London bus involved? It was the wrong month for the London Marathon. I was on an online semiotic journalistic journey. So I Googled the man's name, Rob Sloan, And this is what came up. I looked at the search page quickly. I noticed the London dateline, saw it was the Huffington Post, and clicked. The story didn't clarify much, and the London dateline and the stock bus photo caused confusion. The London dateline was because the story was produced by the AP in their London bureau and picked up by the Huffington Post. But the news didn't happen in London. It was near Newcastle. The Huff Post used a stock image of a London bus, but at least chose one that looked like it was in the city and not at some wedding in the country. I had to get to Newcastle, so I clicked on the BBC story at the bottom of the search page. It led to its regional page, covering the Tyne and Wear area in the north. At least Rob Sloan was no longer a London man. He was from up north. And it was no longer a London bus. It was the Kielder Marathon. I knew where I was now and got my who and where questions answered. The print story was sparse, so I clicked on the video link, and nearly halfway in, there was footage from the actual race, with a venue-specific bus. At this point, I didn't entirely trust the bus motif, and it was a short broadcast story, so I went to a print source. The first link on the search page, a story by The Telegraph. As is typical in print, there is the time and space to include more detail, and the reporter delivered. This photo is, quote, one of 12 buses laid on to ferry spectators around the lakeside course, unquote. So let's trace the story trajectory and the semiotic detours prompted by the London bus. I've included the order I read the stories in with the chronological time of publication to the right. The order isn't the same. The BBC's regional office covered the story first. The Telegraph did its own reporting and provided a lengthy account the next morning. The AP did its own version in the afternoon, likely from the BBC, which the HuffPost picked up. The Yahoo Sports blogger took it from there. Along with noting the story trajectories, we can begin to evaluate what semiotic factors can contribute to a particular reading of it. The London bus allowed American Yahoo and HuffPost readers to think England. The Yahoo blogger used sports slang, which initially led me to think he knew what he was talking about. The UK news sources kept place accurate and relevant, no confusion. Which brings us to larger questions that concern iterativity in news stories, as well as the recursivity dynamic as news goes viral or meanders on lesser paths online, and a methodological suggestion to, metaphorically, follow the bus.